Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and tonight I am so pleased to report that I have the Siegel brothers back on the show, Larry and Ricky Siegel from Florida.
Hello.
Hi. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Pleasure to be back.
Yeah, Ricky is an ASECT certified sex therapist and also sex therapist supervisor, and Larry is a ASECT certified sex educator. So before we go any further, why don't the two of you just take a few minutes to introduce yourselves further?
Okay. Well, sexology, sex therapy is kind of a strange field to be in, and lots of people find a lot of strange ways into it. I don't find too many people that said, when they were 12 years old, I want to grow up and be a sex therapist. So like a lot of folks, I kind of found myself in part following Larry and inheriting some jobs as sexuality education. And we both started doing sex ed for Planned Parenthood here in South Florida, and really connected it when Larry was doing sex ed and I was working in chemical dependency treatment. And that's where we found that common ground with work that still 25 years later is really not being done very effectively. And talking about sexuality issues in addiction and treatment and recovery. Of course, you know from our previous discussions that a lot of that includes present debates with sex addiction and so-called porn addiction. So I'm glad we have a chance to continue the conversation this evening. But I really find it incredibly rewarding, and I feel lucky to make my living as an educator and a sex therapist and train other therapists and medical professionals to do sex therapy and sexuality counseling.
And this is Larry Siegel, and I also started as a sexuality educator for Planned Parenthood. I sort of came into the field through drug and brain research. I used to do research in psychopharmacology. And at about the same time, I started getting interested in the sort of neuroanatomy and physiology, what's happening in the brain and nervous system with sexual response. I developed a bad allergy toward my rats and could not work in the lab anymore. So I kind of like to say I got into sex because of rats. And from there, I was lucky enough to sort of find a different direction for my interests, and ended up having the honor of being the first male sexuality educator in Florida with Planned Parenthood, and then started in with a private practice as well, and then the sexuality education part mingled more with the sexuality therapy part, and started getting more into training and education. And in addition to being university-based and teaching a lot of different psychology and sexuality as well as pharmacology courses, I do really, really enjoy the opportunity to train other professionals in sexology, sex therapy, and sexuality in general. Get to meet some amazing people, such as and especially yourself.
Oh my goodness.
Just love doing this work. I mean, how can there be anything bad in helping people have better sex and feel better about themselves sexually?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so we have done a lot of work together and with other colleagues focusing on the dangers of the sex addiction model for treating or looking at sexual issues that many clients come through the door with or concerns. And that's been work that I felt pretty passionate about, especially coming at it from the Mormon lens, where I think anything outside of what's considered religiously acceptable is then quite often deemed addictive or problematic in ways that sometimes exaggerates the problems. It can be quite shaming. So now the other problem that we seem to have is that because we're doing all this advocacy and talking about this, that I get accused quite often of being pro-porn and that I have no issues with pornography and that I'm pushing pornography or things of that nature. So kind of the either or scenario. And so I invited both of you tonight to be able to talk a little bit about what maybe are some legitimate concerns that we would have around erotic films, especially when it comes to our adolescents and pre-adolescent children that may come across some of this material, and how we are approaching this as parents and educators and ecclesiastical leaders, etc., in our communities. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about tonight. Very happy to have you both on. So why don't we start right off the bat with what are some of our concerns? And I think maybe sometimes why we're off-putting to people is that we tend to not blame pornography itself for issues. We try to, we tend to blame other things.
Right.
And I think people in general are uncomfortable with erotic film and see it from a very moral perspective and lens, which people have a right to do and have their own values around those issues. But I think as sexual educators and psychologists, we tend to look at it more from a perspective of trying to understand the underlying issues without necessarily the moral framing, respecting moral framings, of course, that people come in with, but not necessarily looking at it from that lens. So let's just get right on the topic of maybe what you feel are the top issues that occur.
Well, if I could, Natasha, I could just respond to that what you just said, because I think that's really the important setup for framing the whole discussion. Even, folks would say framing the debate. I don't even really see it as a debate, like there's a pro-porn or an anti-porn argument. And I think we're just so used to this. And the decades we've been doing sex ed, there always seems to be this desire to make every issue about a pro or a con thing. So even just sex ed in general, the great sex ed wars of the 90s, when the Bush administration was funding all of this abstinence only till marriage and literally writing into federal law just ridiculous, untrue statements like, I used to be able to recite the entire A through H criteria.
Oh, well, like in particular,
only education.
Right.
Sex, and here's one I can quote: "Sex in the context of marriage is the only acceptable standard for human sexual behavior."
That's followed by, and I quote, "Sex outside marriage is likely to have significant physical and psychological harm."
Right. So, it's this porn, I think, gets swept up into this. You used the term, I wonder how people respond to, because, usually it's like one of those terms that only sexologists use, and that is erotica or erotic material. And from, back in my sex educator days, I wish I can remember the source for this, but I remember learning somewhere along the line, somewhere in my epistemology, this idea that pornography, specifically, Larry, back me up on this, is kind of a legal term that refers to erotica that has a specific content or theme: abuse, exploitation, kids, rape, right? Anything that is not, people enjoying themselves, any genre, any type, better described as erotica, and pornography tends to be like a legal term. Am I remembering?
I mean, it's a quality, and I think there was that element, if I remember correctly, of pornography stimulating prurient interest.
Well, that's like the definition of obscenity, which
right,
that Supreme Court judge famously said, "I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it."
Right, and that's kind of, I think, legally how porn and obscenity did become very linked.
Sure, but see, again, this sweeping it up in this cascade of all the ills of society.
So
right?
You're saying that originally the word pornography was legalistically meant to only denote sexual acts that were captured in film or literature or whatever that were abusive or violent of some nature. Is that what you're saying? Then that somehow that term has been generalized.
Yeah. So, it's not, we're not comfortable referring to it as erotica. Like I said, only sexologists use that term. But, we usually refer to anything and everything. Anybody over 30 might remember that there used to be magazines that had erotic content before the internet. And, people would debate whether or not there's a line to be drawn between, say, Playboy and Penthouse. That Larry Flint was going out of his way to be provocative and offensive. Hugh Hefner was considered to be more, again, depending on one's perspective, celebrating women, or just as disgusting a pornographer as Larry Flint. But I think, they're still pulling the camera back, so to speak. There's, again, we have to put it in the context of sexuality education. And, we discussed this recently in our training in Kansas, which thanks again for a wonderful, wonderful time. Mm-hmm. But this whole debate about porn and blaming porn, one of the biggest elephants in the room that nobody's talking about is the euphemism for masturbation that the phrase looking at porn has become. Just like, sleeping together is kind of a ridiculous euphemism for having sex. That's the issue that's avoided and that we don't want to talk about more than anything else. So we'll spend decades arguing and blaming porn rather than being comfortable enough to talk about and educate our kids about a healthy relationship with masturbation. I mean, there's way too many stories, including from the Mormon faith, of kids committing suicide over masturbation guilt, which is, I couldn't imagine a worse collective failure on the part of letting down kids than letting them grow up with that level of shame and guilt and feeling like they're wrong.
Okay. So right off the bat, I think what you're trying to say is by framing the conversation, we are saying that regardless of people's values on these topics, there's going to be some level of subjectivity that everybody is a part of.
Well, I don't think it's possible to be objective in defining what is pornography or what is obscene. That's the age-old debate. I mean, if cavemen masturbated to stick drawings of boobies on a cave wall, was that the first porn problem? And if a caveman stayed in the cave all day instead of hunting, was he a porn addict?
Right. Yeah.
I didn't think about that one.
Right. It's getting in the way of his livelihood. And
those guys around the fire.
Yeah.
What happened before fire? So, yeah, and I think another part of this, too, that's kind of contextual, that I think you sort of started off with as well, is I think a big problem we have, because there is a lot of that very subjective context that people look at porn in, whether it's a context of faith or religion or their particular brand of morality or whatever it is that people use to judge it. I mean, it is very, very subjective. And for a lot of people, it is very uncomfortable. Just the idea of being aroused by something other than someone you're not married to is a discomforting idea for a lot of people. So it then becomes very easy to project all of these ills and evils on porn. And we get caught into, I think, like you had started out mentioning, there's this binary that if you are not talking about the evils of porn, if you are not supporting it, that it is the most awful thing in the world, then you are promoting it.
Yeah, and who wants to be on that TV interview? Oh, so you must be pro-porn then. Mm-hmm. And, like our friend David Lay had that experience on Katie Couric's show, where unfortunately, as we've seen as recently as last night, people don't want to be confused with facts when their emotions are threatened. So, Katie Couric actually said to Dr. Lay, I'm sorry, but if you say according to the research one more time, I'm going to reach out and choke you. And, yeah, heaven forbid, we have research that backs up that no, it's not the porn. It's probably in the relationship. Go, you and your research, nerd. Just look, let me believe that porn is evil and it destroys relationships, and don't confuse me with your sciencey talk.
Yeah, and I think even any type of data or science aside, it's just the script. There's a script that people want to see fulfilled, and that is one that does demonize porn. And we cannot allow, there's like no room for a healthy relationship with porn, for people to, freely and in a positive way enjoy erotic images and movies and things like that. There's that automatic, almost absolute, you just can't do it. It's bad, stop. And there's really no nuance in the debate. And I think coming back to how do we frame this discussion, and I agree with what Ricky said before, it really isn't a debate, it should be a discussion. How do we frame that? And it should not be with the emphasis on porn. Just sometimes literally, beating people over the head with it until they finally accept your way. And I think that's the biggest obstacles we have in having real and fruitful discussions about it, because people do get very defensive that if they hear you're not demonizing it, there's like, wait a minute, you must be for it. You're, and again, like you said, pro-porn as opposed to anti-porn. And those are the only two positions we're allowed.
For years, Larry and I talked about this in our trainings on child sexual abuse, that there was a famous, in the mid-90s, there was a famous meta-analysis published by Temple University researchers, where they looked at 50 years worth of studies on child sexual abuse. Their population was college students who reported as explicit as possible, quote, child-adult sexual contact during childhood. And there was just such outrage at the publishing of a study that found, except in cases of really severe, violent, very violent, severely traumatic sexual assaults. And repeated. By far and away, the majority of people in all of the studies over a 50-year period turned out to be perfectly healthy, well-adjusted adults.
Resilient,
right. That was the overwhelming theme. And there was such outrage. First of all, I mean, even little things like, why did you use the term child-adult sexual contact instead of child sexual abuse? You must be in favor of it. No, it's because researchers are obliged to use explicit language, and to call it child sexual abuse is a judgment. It's not a description of explicit behavior like child-adult sexual contact is. So this was the lens, right? It got to a fever pitch that led to Congress getting involved and actually convening to, I mean, this was the most absurd thing either of us had ever seen to that point in our careers.
Don't think it's ever happened before or since.
Congress convened to basically agree to ignore the findings of the study. So we, it's like, remember when you're kids, the equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears and going la 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 if somebody says something that you don't like.
And let me also throw in that happened after the same congressional committee sent the study back to the APA to redo the analysis.
Yeah, they said
because it could not be right.
Right.
Came back, they said we could not find any fault. All of the data, the conclusions fit the data. So it was kind of like Mikey from Life Cereal. Well, you know what? Forget him. Let's send it to the National Academy of Sciences. They won't like it. They don't like anything. And to their chagrin, the National Academy of Sciences came back and said we cannot find any fault with the statistical analyses. So then they said, well, you know what? Screw everybody. And they held that special meeting and made an official recommendation to ignore the findings of a scientific study because it did not fit their script.
Which is that if you have any type of sexual abuse or adult-child contact, that it would ruin you for life is
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
which is actually not helpful to people who've dealt with traumatic situations such as that, because we know through positive psychology studies that the more you're able to believe in yourself and have hope and resilience and have that positive thinking of being able to push through a negative event, that people do better.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually kind of excited when I heard the results, and we were talking to the guy afterwards, because to me, that's exactly what that meant. You know what? We can really honor and we build on the resilience, the strength, the positive attributes that people have. We don't have to re-look at them. I think therapists often re-traumatize people by looking at them with that damaged lens. Some therapists will bring particularly sexual abuse and trauma survivors, victims, to that place of being a survivor. And for me, there's really no difference in somebody who wears the banner of survivor between them and those who wear the banner of victim. I want to break through that with them and get to the positive, resilient, strong, worthy things that are there, and let the person be that.
We've all seen the incredible levels of victimization that people present in our offices because they found that their partner is looking at porn.
Right. I was going to say, this is
their
part of that
lives
context.
are destroyed as if they themselves were violently attacked.
Porn is a really good context for people to create these victim positions with.
Well, it goes back to the power of suggestion, right? That if you grow up with, like you're saying, a script where, which we do this in Mormonism, we do set up the fragile female type of narrative who's supposed to be protected and is a precious daughter of God. We set up the narrative that the man is probably having a hard time controlling his natural urges and therefore somewhat less spiritual or less moral or righteous to begin with, and therefore she has to protect herself from him. So right away we've got a script of opponents, and if he, especially the man, deviates from the sexual narrative of worthy sex as the church prescribes, then yeah, we have a wounded female that has been very much taught how to respond to that type of scenario. And not to minimize pain and betrayal, that's not our point here.
No.
Because there is betrayal when people are not honest about their sexuality with one another. I'm just trying to frame it from the sense of there are cultural contexts that we all come from, whether it's Mormonism or American culture, or whether you come from another country. Each culture has its own scripts. And then going back to pornography, and the subjectivity of how we even frame that word, a very famous quote by one of our leaders is something along the lines of, don't be walking pornography. So in other words, even just dressing to a point where you might show some shoulder or some cleavage as a Mormon, adolescent woman or young woman or even adult woman, you might turn into something that's arousing to another individual. So you have something like somebody walking down the street to something quite explicitly, maybe even violent on a video screen, as a huge spectrum, right? From one extreme to another as far as what people are naming this one word, pornography, which is, I think, your point.
Yeah, and again, there's a wide range. We really can't use that broad, sweeping brush because we see. I mean, there are a number of articles and there are a number of groups that sort of do that, and they talk about the relationship between porn and violence against women, and saying that porn is violence against women, without really qualifying that what they were looking at was violent porn, not mainstream porn, not subscription type of porn, not anything that most people would see. That was very niche, very specialty type of thing. But using that broad brush, it paints a very different picture.
Even how you define violence, because there's many
Right.
people who might feel like any objectification, any woman who is even consensually allowing herself to be photographed or videoed, even if she is enjoying it or having pleasure, is an objectification. She comes from an objectified culture, and so there's that argument as well.
Yeah, and again, not to discount any of these, attitudes or beliefs or perspectives, but I think number one, they come with a lot of assumptions, and they come with very little understanding, I think, of the people that are involved. Because there's just a lot of this negative porn rhetoric, and it makes it difficult to, I think, have a meaningful and significant discussion, even within a relationship, if we're stuck in these, first of all, these roles. I am the victim, you are the perpetrator. And I'm only going to let you kind of, acknowledge me as a victim. And then there's all the dog housing that comes along with that. And, it seems that it's rarely an opportunity for couples to talk and move together. It just seems to be this just widely, almost universal wedge that people seem very willing to sort of drive in between them.
Okay, and then just to go back to a few things that you mentioned that I think are really important as far as being able to challenge the scripts, especially that we teach our kiddos about, is one of the abstinence messages that you talked about is that somehow married sex is healthy sex and unmarried sex is unhealthy sex, which really sets up some problematic issues that we can maybe get into a little bit when I know that I've worked with many people who are really struggling in a marital sexual relationship or even come from an abusive marital sexual relationship. And I think when you just, again, make it so simplistic, you don't really prepare people to sexually negotiate or contract a good, healthy sexual relationship within a marriage. And then also this power of suggestion that if you have sexual experiences outside of a marriage, that somehow that needs to be looked through the lens of unworthiness or unhealth or somehow baggage that now I'm bringing to a committed relationship later, which again may or may not be the case as far as having a positive experience with a person outside of a marital relationship. Anything you'd want to add to that?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's no, I think you I like what you said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take the easy way out and being interviewed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. Well said.
I like these to be more discussional anyway than just asking you a bunch of questions.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, there's still this. Wow, there's such rigid expectations and such pressure to stay on the right side of a very, very fuzzy line that, even marital sex, when does it become kinky? If it strays from missionary sex every other Saturday night, if one partner requests a particular sexual activity, then there's this kind of automatic, where did you learn that from? You're getting that from porn, and now you're bringing that disease into our marital bed. And there's this kind of, again, rules about what's normal or acceptable or healthy sex and what's problematic or the sign of some, of course, porn is the only thing I could think of where people have this automatic fear, this classic slippery slope that whatever one is looking at, part of the addiction model, you will definitely become tolerant to and require increasing doses of more intense, bizarre forms of porn. And then, of course, it's only a matter of time before one steps out of the computer and into the real world and starts trying to act out the most bizarre and twisted, violent paraphilias that people can imagine.
Which actually is one path that people will cite. Another one being they may not even get to that point because they're spending their time and they're creating their attachments with pixels on a screen. And a lot of these people will now say, well, especially when it comes to any kind of sexual gratification, you release oxytocin and that causes you to bond with that person. So if your early experiences are really more about porn, then your oxytocin is being released and you're bonding with the pixels on your screen, and you'll be incapable of having a relationship with another person because the only thing that you respond to is the online porn.
Ay, ay, ay.
So, I mean, it gets incredibly absurd in every direction you look at in terms of where a lot of these people go, which makes it even more difficult to have a good framing in which to talk to young people about. That doesn't involve what kind of sex they're supposed to be having, what rules they must be following. Now, I know in the Mormon Church, that's a big issue, in terms of there are some clear boundaries around sexual behavior, but isn't there also a little latitude for people to be erotic and share pleasure with each other?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's definitely, we have some great pleasure-centered doctrine. And as far as being, and in fact, that's kind of like what our purpose in life is to experience joy and pleasure. And I think the creation of the human body is seen as something that's a gift and an experience we're meant to have here in this world. And we have heavenly parents who have bodies like ours, so there's nothing demeaning or horrible about a human body. So there's definitely a lot of potential for, I think, sex positivity within Mormonism that I often try to point out, right, or bring to light. Like, we have this stuff that's we kind of hide behind the more scary stuff instead of celebrating the sex positive messages that I think are very findable in Mormonism.
And let me just say, I think that's a big part of what all of this stuff exists in. It's easier to default to the negative stuff, to be afraid, than it is to really dive into that world of sex positivity, see where we can go together, how far we can go, what kinds of things we can do. There's so much unknown and often excitement in that, but for a lot of people, that's a source of fear. So the proscripted rules and regulations and the things that are forbidden and the things that bring shame are kind of easier to follow. They're more clear.
Right.
But I can't help but think that within that realm of sex positivity and potential for sex positivity, there is within, sort of Mormonism, that there can also be a lot of these conflicts and confusions about, we have this freedom, but we also have these very solid lines that are drawn all around us. So where do we turn? How do we go? How do we navigate this?
Yeah, it's the classic agency dilemma, right? So we believe that God gave us our agency, and that's a huge, powerful gift that we get to choose for ourselves which path to go. But at the same time, we're very clear that this is the path you should choose. so If you choose something other than that, you're using your agency in the wrong way, and therefore, you fall into a lot of the shaming and negative messages if people explore or act in ways that aren't prescribed, which in our church are pretty rigidly prescribed. I mean, to the point that masturbation is seen as a sin. So even something that's deemed normative by the Pediatric Association, in our church, people are shamed from a pretty early age for just wanting to explore their own bodies and self-soothe in a way that's normative and developmentally appropriate.
Absolutely.
So with that context in place, and just to also remind people that what you were talking about, the pixels thing, that there's no research to support that. So let's just put that out there, that you do not bond to your computer.
I was kind of being condescending or when I was putting that out there. So hopefully nobody took me seriously as making that statement.
Right. But we do hear a lot of those fears, right? That somehow kids are less social, that kids are less able to form relationships because they're spending too much time in front of their screens. And then that's taken to a whole nother level of frenzy when that's including sex.
Yeah.
Right.
One of our favorite authors and drug researchers is a guy named Andrew Weil. And he started some of the first marijuana studies back in the 1960s and made a statement in one of his books called The Natural Mind that, of course, at that time and still to this day, I think there's a lot of people who believe that whether there is or not, there are people who just believe that there is this firmly established body of research that proves that marijuana causes this amotivational syndrome, right? Everybody's heard of that. But Weil offers the thought that isn't it just possible that unmotivated people like smoking weed? So, it just kind of turns like it makes a chicken or egg question out of what's taken as a cause and effect thing.
Right.
So, if a kid's sitting around looking at porn on his computer all day, that's identified as the problem. That's the disease.
Right.
And, the same way we talk about these sex addiction cases with couples, why aren't we asking, why is the kid spending all this time alone? And why does he have all this time on his hands? And why is his go-to coping mechanism porn?
Right. Like maybe he has some social anxiety or some depression or a variety of other issues that could be happening. Correct. Okay.
If he gets busted, then, all the focus is on the porn and all the computers are eliminated and he's not allowed to go to the library and he's not allowed to be on a computer and nobody's addressing the problem.
Because blaming the porn is easier.
Nobody's talking to the kid. Same way, we talked about this with couples who present for sex therapy. We get accused of, like that blogger. Don't let these sex therapists try and say that the wife's too much of a prude and doesn't give the husband enough sex, so that's why he has no choice but to resort to porn. And of course, that's just a whole pile of nonsense. But I certainly do want to know if a couple if we have a sexless marriage, then it certainly seems logical that one or the other looking for some other sexual outlet is not such a mystery, and that blaming that outlet is not very productive to finding out what's going on in that relationship.
Right. Okay, so given all of that context and maybe the context that I'll set up now, which erotica or pornography or however we want to define those terms can be anything from suggestive pictures with cleavage or nipples that are showing through a particular blouse or things of that nature to explicit video where sexual acts are being portrayed by adult people. This is the spectrum that we have to work with. What I would like to get into next then are what maybe are some of the concerns that parents or educators might want to consider as far as some of the regular themes that come up that our kids might be exposed to as they search and explore these media outlets.
Are you referring to the kind of content that they're exposed to, or the issues that may arise as a result of their being exposed to certain content?
So let's start with the themes, and then maybe we can go to if there are any concerns that we might have to specific content. But for example, I think a very simple one would be the idea that most erotic literature, videos, whatever, is a form of fantasy, right? So you're not necessarily seeing a regular run-of-the-mill relationship in action. You're seeing actors, you're seeing something that is either in real life or in imagination. It's a story. It's a storyline. There's a plot. There's music in the background. There's just things about it, right?
And I think that's important, and because to point out that a lot of porn, even mainstream porn, this is not how people behave. These are, and I hate to use the word because it's maybe a little too loaded, but these are kind of aberrant sexual practices that unfortunately get normalized. Right? But if I can just take a step back before, because if we're talking about especially adolescents and young people in general who are being exposed, they're coming across, or they're looking for, and of course parents find it, either they see them on the screen or they find in the browser history. I think to start with, because you talk about themes, I think there's a couple of different levels of these themes. The first being that parents should not, and I would say ever, punish or shame their kids if they find them basically surfing and using porn. It should not be an opportunity for punishment. It should be an opportunity for discussion, to talk to them about it. It's an opportunity to normalize the fact that, adolescents, young people have these sexual feelings. They have these abilities to be aroused. All of this stuff is normal. And I think this can be an opportunity to bring that out.
I also think we're a little bit beyond the need to normalize the reality that there's porn on the internet. I mean, it's almost 2017, for crying out loud. I still see people that are like shocked at that. And, any thought of trying to get rid of porn on the internet is like sweeping the ocean with a broom. Mm-hmm. Good luck with that.
Right. And it shouldn't be, again, adversarial against porn. It should be about how do we educate our kids.
Exactly.
Right? So, I think just with that whole idea of that theme being that, this is an opportunity for discussion, not for shame or punishment, then, when you look at some of these other themes, then as you mentioned, these are not normal, quote unquote, sexual practices that people regularly do, even though people like to try to emulate that. I think it's important for adolescents, especially, to realize that this, almost everything they see is a reflection of basically an adolescent male sexual fantasy, that none of this reflects the majority of women's desires, what women like, what women enjoy. So like you said, it is a specific storyline, right, in a specific presentation, and it's not educational.
So can you talk about some of the maybe bullet points of what a typical male sexual fantasy storyline includes?
Well, I want you to answer it, but I think it's important to go back to what Larry started to address earlier, the connection to what we can kind of call the precursor to porn, the themes in music videos, and just want to, kind of couch it in, I think, an important historical context, and that is also to acknowledge the impact that the internet has had, and we don't mean to minimize that in any way, because of course we all know it's been really intense. That there was a time just a generation ago where if somebody wanted to see a pornographic video, they had to go to the adult movie theater in the sleazy part of town and hope that nobody saw them going in or out. And then, the home video kind of revolutionized the porn industry when people can watch VHS tapes in the privacy of their own home. And then, of course, now people talk about this AAA engine of internet porn being access and anonymity and availability. I don't know. But of course, it's just exponentially magnified the whole thing, but also take up this kind of sociological impact that the music video has taken from.
Yeah. The music video industry really is a parallel to the porn industry. In fact, a lot of music video directors have also directed a lot of porn. There's, I think, very common themes where it's, again, about this adolescent male sexual fantasy, where women's role is simply to be there for the gratification of men. You see this a lot in music videos as well, and pretty much any genre now, that if women don't go along with it, if they don't sort of buy into that, there are consequences. Some videos will, sort of abuse women, push her around, spray her with champagne, pour stuff all over her. There's degrading things that happen if you don't go along. So there's messaging that a lot of these kids have been exposed to from day one that's already been doing the things people are worried about porn doing. It's already creating these values.
Yeah.
There was a study done after a documentary on music videos was made in the late 90s, and they basically did a survey of, I think, 10,000 15 to 19-year-olds across the US. And some of the findings were maybe disturbing, but not surprising. Others were both surprising and deeply disturbing. For example, 85% of adolescent males, 15 to 19, say that if they can get away with it and they would not get into any trouble for it, they would rape a woman. Now, for a lot of these kids, these are attitudes that have developed before they even, got to porn. About 80% of adolescent males say if they spend a lot of money on a girl on a date, she's obligated to have sex with him. And a lot of money was defined as $20. Now, I find that disturbing, but not surprising. What bothered me even more was the 42% of girls in that same age group that agree.
Huh.
Right.
So when you talk about the messaging and the scripting and the impact of these things on sexuality, by the time a lot of these kids ever get to porn, it's already there, and that's why again I call music videos the precursor, because music videos are shot very much in a pornographic way, dehumanizing, de-individuating women, only showing them in silhouette, only showing body parts. There's a thing that this guy, Sut Jolly, who's a sociologist who made this documentary, refers to the way the camera pans up and down a woman's body as this pornographic gaze.
Yeah.
Right? The women always having that look that they wanted, which is another theme in both porn and music videos. Not only the expectation by males that women are there for the male's gratification, but that women really want that.
Yeah.
Can I even go back a little bit past music videos? Like,
Sure.
at some level, we're consumers of all of this for reasons, right? And so,
Right.
I mean, we come from patriarchal, objectifying cultures for now, I think, millennia, if that's fair to say. And so,
Around it. Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, there's a reason why even music videos carry some of these themes, or why these themes seem exciting, erotic, and sexy. And I mean, women being property or being sexual objects for men is, I think, a pretty ancient concept.
Sure. And it was actually the law of the land until fairly recently here.
So are we surprised that these things have been then eroticized in our psyches?
And
No.
you also used the word consumers. This same sociologist makes the point that music videos are basically commercials for the CD. And they spend millions of dollars to shoot them like little mini movies, and it's really basically to get you to go out and buy the CD. So just like any other commercial for any other product, what gets the viewer's attention? Sex and violence, unfortunately. It's such an interesting historical evolution of that industry, of both of those industries, because porn stars wanted to be in music videos and rock stars wanted to be porn stars. And they just, if somebody could even name a porn star, probably a guy who kept it to himself. And now, they're mainstream celebrities rubbing elbows with Hollywood stars.
As I was saying earlier, like since especially the late '80s, there's been that mainstreaming of porn, and a lot of it has been that they both became a cliche. The rock star and the porn star, are hooking up,
or the rock star sex tape that gets, quote, leaked out.
Right. And again, we started to see girls aspiring to this.
Paris Hilton.
And again, then the Girls Gone Wild culture that then took hold and all of that kind of stuff.
Which comes from this idea that a woman is, in a sense, valued by how attractive she is able to showcase her body and etc.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Which again is a pretty ancient type of problem that we have.
Sure.
Yeah, that those Girls Gone Wild videos were the reason Larry and I started a program that we used to do back in the Planned Parenthood days that we should probably do again. We do them every year around Father's Day. It was a wonderful program for fathers and daughters called Daddy's Little Girl, the Role of Fathers in the Healthy Sexual Development of Their Daughters. I know we're big on long titled workshops. That was a powerful one.
Tell us a little bit about what the purpose of that was.
The girls would meet separately with another therapist and talk about adolescent development issues and things that maybe they wish they could talk to their parents, in particular their dad, with. And the dads met separately with us, and then we brought them together, and so nobody had to be put on the spot, or just had the girls as a group talk to the dads, and it was always a very emotional experience, and guys always come away realizing, we talk about a lot of the scripts that guys grow up with, a lot of the Madonna whore dilemma kinds of things. It's interesting to see guys kind of get busted with the attitudes they have about their own daughters, and then, the way they might talk about other women or women on television or porn stars. The girls get a chance to sort of ask dad maybe tough questions without just one-on-one, but just a whole group of daughters asking a whole group of dads.
And for me, one of the powerful things that came out of that as well is, in a number of cases, really sort of helping dads reconnect with their daughters. Because what we found, and it's something that I've always found pretty sad and kind of, well, just a little sad, I guess, that the time when adolescent girls are really starting to change and develop, it's really a time where they, I think, really need a connection with their dads. And unfortunately, that's a time when a lot of dads disconnect from their daughters because they start worrying now that their daughter's body's changing, now that there are little breastlets and these the changes that are taking place. A lot of dads don't hug their daughters anymore. They don't want to feel those breasts pressing against them. They're now thinking of their daughters in these sexualized ways. And it is a sexualized way when you're worried about getting an erection when you hug your daughter. Right? That is looking at your daughter in a sexualized way.
I think the disconnect starts with the period, when dads usually jump in the back seat and go, "Up, that's your mother's department," and they start to move away. So sometimes the daughter's moving towards him and he's backing away.
So, and again, as we're even talking about this, I can't help but wonder if that might be something that would, again, I think, be helpful to bring back, because in what we're talking about, these discussions, particularly with porn, a lot of these girls don't have a sort of good male perspective that they can sort of use as a reference point. And by the same token, I think a lot of guys don't have a good female perspective to use as a reference point. Right? So I think this is something that the mothers, daughters, fathers, sons, we should be, I think, maybe trying to bring this a little bit more together to really talk about this stuff, not wait for it to be a crisis, but see it as a developmental issue.
So I have two thoughts as the two of you are talking, so I'll just try to split them up. The first one is, so as you mentioned, music videos and pornography having this male script where females are, in essence, a gratification object for male sexual erotica. There's obviously the mother tentacles coming up in me, right? And also just, understanding why it's so easy for parents to then take these positions of, well, of course you shouldn't be looking at those things, right? No porn, no music videos. And there are parents who are quite strict about that, have tons of computer filters, right? And all these types of ways that they try to control the media of their children. And is there anything wrong with the idea of trying to keep our kids away from that type of material to begin with, especially since there is obviously more availability now than ever. Like you said before, it was probably harder for a 15-year-old to get access to maybe a father's Playboy collection versus now most kids have a smartphone and it's at the tip
Right.
of their hands.
Right. And that's the answer to your question.
Yeah.
Is there anything wrong with parents wanting to keep their kids away from that? Absolutely not. Is it realistic? No, it is not. All the filters in the world, and again, they're good places to start, but I think there's a kind of a little delusional element to thinking that we're going to be able to control what kids see.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not going to happen. And I don't mean to be pessimistic, just realistic about that. So I don't think the emphasis should be on what can we prevent them from doing or keep away from them, but rather how can we teach them to better manage it, to have a good perspective on it, to not let it sort of impact them in a negative way.
And how can we encourage the conversation? Because I think, another truth from the sex ed days, that if a kid asks a question and gets a negative response from the parent, it's not that they're not going to ask again. They're just not going to ask that parent again.
Right.
So the loud and clear message is, you can't bring this to me. I'm not comfortable enough with it. Or I'm just going to yell at you and tell you to stay away from it. So I would think most parents would agree that the last thing they'd want to see is some behavior that gets painted as forbidden and therefore subverted. So now this is where the guilt and shame comes from. Again, it's like you tell them not to do it, so what? They're not going to do it? No, they're going to do it and feel bad about it. That's not to say that we would say, well, screw it, just go ahead and do it. But we would want to talk about why it's, how it can be problematic, and why, as we've been saying this whole time, it should be in the context of good, comfortable sex ed conversations.
So how do we talk to men and boys about things, for example, like you mentioned a father noticing that he might have an erection as he notices his daughter's breast developing, or a young man who is able to be honest about the idea that he might have a rape fantasy if he could get away with it? How do we have those types of conversations without eliciting the shame that then can become problematic or shut conversations down?
Well, I think part of, and again, I don't know if this is really about just eliciting it, but I think it's about doing it in a way that I think normalizes, these things, to try to take away a lot of that shame. The fact is that when men feel good, regardless of why, they may get an erection. Right? And it's not something that he should be ashamed of, but certainly something he might want to, just look at and see what he may be reacting to. Can he do some reframing in his mind? But not be afraid and ashamed and drive it all underground. The same way with the adolescent boy who may have a rape fantasy. Right? And again, regardless of whether he's fantasizing about raping somebody or if he's fantasizing about being raped, there's a discussion here about fantasy. The nature of fantasy, what it is about, how we deal with things that we find arousing, and that it is normal to be aroused by any number of things, even if they don't seem like they are what you see everywhere around you. To normalize that, to remove the shame, and then allow for the room to be able to say, how does this fit in my life?
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that if they have a fantasy, that they believe that means they have to act on that fantasy. And that's another teachable moment that I think there's a lot of relief that people find in knowing that a fantasy in and of itself is just that. Of course, we talk about distressing fantasies, and people might come to us as therapists and say, I'm really freaked out by this thought I have. Please help me not have it. Well, short of a shovel in the back of the head, I don't know too many therapy techniques that can help somebody stop having a fantasy. But instead, to help somebody find a comfort and acceptance that having a fantasy doesn't mean acting on it or engaging in a behavior. Maybe sometimes we might have to help people find other fantasies if particular ones are causing too much distress.
minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.